What's something your parents believe that you don't?
While I was overseas, serving in a place where every day felt like survival and where the only thing that kept me moving forward was the thought of coming home to the life I had built, my brother was back here taking that very life and claiming it as his own. And I can tell you right now that there are no words sharp enough to describe what it feels like when you discover that the people you trusted most in the world, the ones you thought would protect you when you weren't there to protect yourself, were the very same people who stripped you of everything that made the fight worth enduring. I didn't learn about it all at once. It was a slow, creeping realization that started with little details in letters and conversations with my parents, who became strangely vague whenever I asked how my husband was doing, brushing me off with comments like, "He's fine, don't worry, just focus on yourself," and at first I let it slide because I told myself they didn't want to burden me while I was away. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore the way they never mentioned his name with the same ease they once did. I came back expecting some version of normal, maybe not perfect, but familiar enough to give me the sense that what I had sacrificed meant something, and instead I walked into a silence that had weight to it. Like everyone in the room was holding their breath around me, careful with their words, as though they all knew something I didn't. My brother was there, and my husband was there, and neither of them could look me straight in the eye, but my parents carried on like nothing was wrong, making small talk, passing food around the table, pretending this was still the same family I had grown up in. I didn't ask right away, partly because I didn't want to believe the suspicion that was building in my chest, and partly because I wanted to see how long they could hold up the act. How long they thought they could keep me sitting there like a fool while my whole marriage had already been gutted behind my back. It finally came out when I asked directly about my husband, because he hadn't even offered to pick me up when I returned home, and my mother's face tightened for just a second before she said, "He and your brother have gotten very close while you've been away. And it's better for everyone if you just accept that." Just like that, as if she were explaining a weather report, she laid down a truth that should have split the earth open, and when I turned to my father for some sign that this wasn't real, that there was some misunderstanding, all he did was drop his eyes to his plate and mutter, "We don't want to lose the family over this, you need to let it go." I don't think I've ever experienced a silence so loud as the one that followed, when I looked at all of them, my parents, my brother, my husband, and realized that not one of them was going to defend me. Not one of them cared about the years I had given to this family, the service I had given to my country, or the fact that I had been building a marriage that I believed in while they were tearing it apart behind closed doors. My husband finally spoke then, mumbling something about, "It just happened, and we didn't mean to hurt you," and the sound of his voice was so small, so pathetic, that it almost made me laugh because I couldn't believe the man I had once trusted with my future had the audacity to sit across from me with my brother's hand resting casually on the back of his chair, as though they had the right to parade their betrayal in front of me like I should be the one embarrassed. My parents started talking over each other, throwing words like, "Family first," "Don't make this harder than it has to be," and "We can get past this," but I wasn't hearing solutions, I was hearing a desperate plea for me to stay quiet. To keep the family image intact, to sacrifice my voice the same way I had already sacrificed so many years away from home. That's when it hit me that what they wanted wasn't peace, it was silence, because silence protected them from shame, while I was expected to swallow the humiliation and carry on as though the life I had built had not been stolen. I leaned back, let them say their piece, and when the noise finally died down, I looked at them, every single one of them, and I said, "You're asking me to pretend nothing happened, but the truth is you already buried this family yourselves, and now you're standing here shoveling dirt on top of it." The room froze, no one dared to respond, and for the first time since I stepped back into that house, I felt a strange calm settle over me, because I knew this wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of something they couldn't even imagine. Because if they thought I was going to be silent, they were about to learn just how much louder I could be when they gave me nothing left to lose. When the first wave of shock wore off and the numbness settled into something colder and more functional, I noticed how quickly silence started doing the work for them. Because my parents kept calling with these soft instructions to stay calm and keep the family together and not embarrass anyone. And a few friends who used to swear they were loyal began sending messages that sounded like they were written with my mother standing over their shoulder, telling me to heal and move forward and not let bitterness make me small. And while I listened and nodded and promised to think about it, I was also making a list in my head of every place my life touched theirs, every account and benefit and piece of paper that connected my name to the people who had turned it into a doormat. I spent long evenings going through statements and emails that I had ignored while overseas because I trusted my husband to handle what needed handling, and as I scrolled through transactions that never made sense to me before, I started recognizing patterns that looked less like household spending and more like a quiet siphon, small transfers labeled with friendly nicknames that suddenly had faces attached to them, and recurring charges that supported a life that did not include me, which felt disgusting and clarifying at the same time because nothing untangles a story like money, and money was telling me that loyalty had been replaced with convenience the second I boarded a plane. My parents tried to keep me busy with family chores and errands so I would feel included, but every invitation came wrapped in a condition that I smile and say nothing and shake my brother's hand like he hadn't gutted me, and when I refused, the conversation turned to how my husband needed stability and how my brother was finally happy and how I, the person who had apparently become difficult and ungrateful, should be the one to compromise for the sake of peace, and I realized they wanted peace. The way people want a rug to hide a stain, which is to say they wanted me to be the rug. So I did something very simple that felt like breathing fresh air for the first time in months, because I went to the benefits portal and removed my husband from my health coverage, citing marital separation and the obvious conflict of interest. And I called the bank and revoked his status as an authorized user on the card that had been quietly funding dinners I was not invited to, and then I activated a credit freeze with every bureau because I knew my brother's credit history like I knew his excuses, which is to say it was always worse than he admitted, and I updated every password and two-factor login that he used to help me with while I was away, and while none of this was dramatic or loud, it felt like I had opened a window in a room they had tried to keep locked, because the first thing that happened was a string of frantic texts from my husband asking why his card was declined at a place I did not recognize, followed by a short message from my mother asking if I could please reconsider the timing since there were important plans in motion. I did not respond immediately because I wanted to watch what would surface when the pressure changed. And by late afternoon my father called with a voice that tried to sound steady and told me there was a mortgage pre-approval that depended on proof of continuous coverage and joint credit history, which they assumed I would maintain out of love for the family. And I let him finish his little speech before I explained, slowly and politely, that love does not require me to underwrite betrayal, and that any lender who wanted to tie my name to a loan for people who used my deployment to rearrange my marriage should hear my side before the ink dried. That night, while they scrambled, I went back into the folders my husband always said not to worry about because he had everything under control, and I found an old power of attorney I had signed before I left, limited and specific to emergencies only. And I noticed a neat stack of scanned pages labeled with my name and the word copies in a way that made my skin crawl, because it told me they were ready to use my past trust as a crowbar for their future, and that was the moment I understood why. My parents begged for silence, since silence was the only thing that kept their favorite narrative from collapsing in front of neighbors and lenders and anyone who ever praised our family for being close. So I made the calls that people like to pretend are complicated when they are really just inconvenient, and I spoke calmly to the lender about a material change in marital status, and I provided the dates that proved their story could not stand. And I submitted a written revocation of any power of attorney not already expired, and by the following morning their pre-approval was on hold pending verification. Their agent was leaving apologetic voicemails about revised timelines. And my mother was sending me a message about how hurtful and unnecessary it all was, to which I replied in one long line that felt like a full breath, explaining that consequences are not cruelty when they are the exact measure of what someone chose, and that I had only just started measuring. And as I put my phone down and let the quiet return, I knew I had taken only the first step, because buried under those scanned pages and stalled applications was something heavier and uglier that they had worked very hard to keep out of sight. Which is why the next move would not be about cards or coverage, but about the part of their life that could not survive daylight, and I was already standing by the switch. If there's one thing I've learned from watching people who hurt you while wearing a smile, it's that they don't fear guilt. They fear exposure, because guilt is private and easy to dismiss, but exposure is public and lingers like smoke in a room you can't leave. And once I understood that, it became painfully clear that my family's entire sense of control relied on silence, performance, and perception. So the moment I started tearing at the edges of that performance, not loudly, not vindicatively, just with surgical precision, the cracks began to spread faster than they could hide them. I didn't start by accusing or explaining or sending mass texts with receipts and timelines, because people don't believe the loud one first. They believe the one who seems calm enough to be trusted. So instead, I showed up at family events with the kind of stillness that unnerves people, the kind that makes them wonder what you know and why you're not saying it. And every time someone asked how I was doing, I smiled just enough and said, "I'm just taking time to process how things went down." And then I paused long enough for it to land, because I didn't need to say more. I let the silence do the heavy lifting. It didn't take long for people to start whispering, not because I fed them stories, but because my brother and my now ex-husband, who apparently thought they could slide comfortably into this shiny new domestic setup without consequences, began behaving like men who had something to defend. And there's nothing more revealing than watching someone scramble to justify what no one has yet accused them of. One cousin asked me in a low voice if it was true that they had gotten together while I was still overseas, and I just shrugged and said, "You'd have to ask them. They seem to have all the answers," and that was it, one sentence. But enough to plant doubt where they had spent months painting themselves as some great love story born from tragedy and timing. I had no interest in drama for the sake of spectacle, but I had every interest in letting them feel the weight of what they did in the place they valued most, the social sphere where appearances were everything, where neighbors and family friends praised their resilience and romanticized their version of events, because it was easier than sitting with the messier, more honest truth. So I gave people the truth in fragments, not bitter, not emotional, just factual little moments where I would mention, casually, that I had found receipts for Valentine's Day dinners dated while I was deployed, or that I had noticed how quickly my husband changed his address on our joint accounts despite telling me nothing had changed. I even let it slip, at one point during a group dinner, that I had found a photo album hidden in a private shared folder online, filled with smiling faces and weekend getaways that overlapped with the dates I had spent sleeping on army cots and writing letters that went unanswered, and while no one reacted in the moment, I could feel the entire table stiffen slightly, as if they were all doing the math in their heads and realizing it didn't add up the way they had been told it did. That's the thing about lies. They don't collapse from direct attack. They collapse when everyone starts quietly realizing they've been made complicit in protecting something that was never true. I didn't have to humiliate them to destroy their illusion. I just had to let them unravel under the pressure of their own inconsistencies. My mother, who once begged me to keep the peace for the sake of appearances, began calling less, and when she did, her voice carried a tension she couldn't hide, as if she was starting to see how fragile her image of the family was when I stopped playing my role in it. My father, who had said almost nothing since the beginning, sent me a message that read simply, "Please stop this," to which I replied, "I haven't started anything, I've only stopped covering for everyone else." The shift was small at first, fewer invitations, shorter conversations, more awkward silences, but it was enough to show me that I was no longer the problem in the room. They were. And the people who once smiled at them with admiration now looked at them with something closer to confusion, because their story was falling apart, not because I destroyed it, but because it couldn't stand without my silence holding it up. And the best part was, I still hadn't made my move. All of this, the cracks, the rumors, the changing tones, happened without me raising my voice once, which meant that when I finally did choose to speak clearly, to reveal what I knew about the financial manipulations and the forged documents and the little side arrangements that had kept them so comfortable while I was deployed, it wouldn't look like vengeance. It would look like truth. They thought I was staying quiet because I was broken, because I had accepted it, because I was too ashamed to fight. They didn't realize I was quiet because I wanted them to hear themselves fall apart. And trust me, they were already starting to listen. By the time they realized the polite silence I had kept was not a sign of surrender, but a strategy with a longer fuse, the foundation they had so proudly built around their version of the truth was already too fragile to survive even the lightest pressure. And the beauty of it all, if I can call it that without sounding cruel, was that I didn't need to scream, didn't need to beg, didn't even need to name what they did, because I understood something my family never did: when people build their entire world around appearances and manipulation, the smallest public crack doesn't just cause embarrassment, it causes collapse. I knew what they were afraid of before they did, because I had lived my entire life watching my parents maneuver every awkward conversation, every uncomfortable truth, every betrayal they couldn't control into something palatable and respectable. And while they loved to talk about integrity and family values and loyalty, what they really meant was, do not break the illusion, do not say the wrong thing in front of the wrong person, and whatever happens, make sure the neighbors can still smile at us like we're better than the rest. So I let them build their little tower out of borrowed lies, then started pulling one stick at a time, always quietly, always deliberately, until the structure they thought would protect them started to lean, not from outside force, but from the weight of its own hypocrisy. I began with the church directory, the one my mother loved so much, the one she bragged about being in with a flattering family photo that had already aged poorly, and I reached out to the administrator under the guise of updating my personal information, casually letting it slip that my marriage had ended due to infidelity between my husband and my brother, and that while I wasn't asking for anyone to be removed or shamed, I thought it was appropriate that the church not circulate a photo or description that no longer reflected the truth. The response was respectful, even apologetic, and within 2 weeks the photo had been pulled from the next print run, replaced with a generic placeholder. My mother called me within hours of noticing, her voice tight, asking why I would do something so public, to which I answered, without raising my tone, that telling the truth about what happened in my own marriage was not public shaming. It was simply correcting a record she had helped distort. She tried to guilt me with the words reputation and community and forgiveness, but I let her rant, knowing full well that the panic behind her voice had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with the fact that people were starting to see her perfect family as something flawed, something fractured, something common. And that was only the first push. I moved on to the Homeowners Association, where my brother had taken over some light leadership duties, mostly for the ego boost and the attention, and sent in a request to review recent votes tied to a landscaping decision that had involved shared costs. I didn't accuse him directly, but I made sure to attach receipts from an account that bore both our names, an account he had dipped into under the pretense of household maintenance while I was overseas, and while I hadn't reported it as theft. I made it clear to the board that I had not authorized those expenses, and that some of the funds may have come from a military spouse's support account. Now, no one wants to touch a situation that even hints at financial misuse involving a deployed service member, and the board reacted exactly how I knew they would, not with confrontation, but with a quiet audit and a polite suggestion that he step down to focus on personal matters, and within a week, his little badge of suburban power had been stripped away. He sent me a text, no words, just a question mark, and I didn't even answer, because if he wanted clarity, he could ask himself how many decisions he made that involved stealing from someone who had once loved him enough to trust him with everything. Meanwhile, I had taken steps to protect myself legally, pulling every joint filing, every shared asset, every document I had once left in the care of a man I no longer recognized, and turning them over to a lawyer who had grown up in our town and who knew exactly how this family liked to operate behind closed doors while keeping the curtains perfectly arranged on the outside. She was sharp, not just in law but in perception, and when I laid it all out for her, the financial overlaps, the insurance documents, the forged signatures, the subtle misuse of my name on shared loans, she didn't hesitate. We built a case not for revenge, but for untangling. That was the word she used, untangle. She said it with the same tone someone might use when cutting vines off a drowning person, and every paper we filed, every account we closed, every demand for documentation we issued was one more thread pulled from the web they had spun around themselves. And it was only then, when the bank called to inform my brother that a freeze had been placed on a property deed pending ownership clarification, that the panic truly set in. They didn't call this time. They sent someone else, an aunt, the one they always used as a buffer when they were too ashamed to speak for themselves, and she arrived with a plate of food and a smile and a half-hearted story about how families go through hard seasons, and how forgiveness was the only way through, and how none of this needed to go any further. I listened patiently, accepted the food, and then said something I had been waiting to say for months. If forgiveness meant forgetting, you would have offered it to me first, but you only came when I stopped playing dumb. She left without touching her coffee, and I watched from the window as she drove away, probably rehearsing how she would relay the conversation back to them, probably spinning it into another tale of how I had changed, how I had become cold, how I was turning my back on family, but I didn't care, because I wasn't turning my back, I was facing forward for the first time in years, and what they saw as destruction was really just exposure, and I still hadn't even shown them everything. The collapse they feared had already begun. They just didn't realize I was the one drawing the blueprint for how far it would go. By the time they finally understood that the story wasn't going away just because they refused to acknowledge it, that I wasn't backing down just because they were tired of being uncomfortable, and that there would be no quiet return to normal where we all just gathered around the same table and pretended nothing happened, they were no longer operating from a place of denial or arrogance, but from something closer to fear. The kind that creeps in slowly when you realize the person you underestimated has stopped asking for an apology and started rewriting the rules of engagement. They thought I wanted revenge, that I was acting out of bitterness, that if they just ignored me long enough or wore me down with silence and guilt, I'd eventually come crawling back for acceptance, for some fragile semblance of family, for that old familiar comfort of being the accommodating one. But what they couldn't wrap their heads around, because they had never truly seen me as someone capable of burning bridges on purpose, was that I had no interest in their version of healing, not when the price was my dignity, not when the only peace they were offering required me to carry their shame in my mouth like a secret I was never allowed to spit out. So when the final blow came, it wasn't loud or angry or chaotic. It was clinical, legal, and public, because I didn't just want them to know that I was done. I wanted the entire community they had fooled for so long to see exactly what kind of house they had built, and how easily it could collapse when even one person refused to keep pretending it wasn't already crumbling from the inside. I filed a formal complaint with the State Bar Association against my brother, outlining not just the personal betrayal, but the financial misconduct tied to the powers of attorney and forged documents he had accessed during my deployment. And I submitted a sworn affidavit detailed, timeline verified, and backed by hard documentation through my attorney, who by then had grown to admire the precision with which I had dismantled this story piece by piece. It wasn't about criminal charges or headlines. I wasn't chasing scandal. I was chasing accountability, because he hadn't just hurt me. He had violated the trust afforded to him by my absence, and when someone uses your service, your sacrifice, your literal physical distance as cover to steal from you and build a life with your husband, they don't deserve the protection of silence. And when the ethics board opened an investigation, even if it was framed as routine review, the impact was immediate and suffocating for them. His firm distanced itself. Clients became wary. Referrals dried up like water in a cracked basin. Meanwhile, my ex-husband, who had once walked into rooms beside me with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he had won something, was now spiraling in his own quiet desperation, because without my financial support, without my name on the documents, without the social respectability that came from being part of a military marriage he hadn't earned, he was just a man who left his wife for her brother, and no matter how they dressed it up, it just happened. We never meant to hurt anyone. Love is complicated. The people around them stopped pretending that the timeline made sense, and started asking questions that couldn't be answered without confronting the truth they had hoped would never see daylight. The final conversation I ever had with my parents came not long after the investigation was announced, when they invited me to meet them neutral ground, quiet restaurant, daylight hours, all very polite, and sat across from me with faces that looked like they had aged 10 years since I last saw them, eyes tired not from grief, but from the exhausting realization that their version of control had expired. My father started with something about family being more important than mistakes, and my mother followed with a trembling voice about legacies and forgiveness, but it was all dressed in the same language they'd always used, language that required me to bend, to fold, to shrink. So I let them speak, and when they finally paused, clearly expecting me to soften, to offer some thread of reconciliation they could grab onto and use to wrap this story up in a neater bow, I looked at them without malice, but also without the smallest drop of pity, and I said, "You're not asking for healing, you're asking me to help you feel better about what you allowed. But I'm not going to be a redemption arc." I stood up, paid my half of the check in full cash, and walked out without saying goodbye, because the truth is, I had already said everything that mattered in the choices I made, the paper trail I left, the silence I shattered, the names I protected, which in the end only included my own. And maybe somewhere deep down they believed that families can survive anything, but what they never understood was that families are not destroyed by betrayal alone, they are destroyed by the insistence that the betrayed pretend it never happened. I didn't lose my family. I lost a group of people who used that word like a shield, who weaponized it to excuse their silence and their complicity and their comfort. And I may have walked away alone, but I did it with my head up, my record clean, and my story intact, not the one they told about me, but the one I finally told for myself. And if they ever tell anyone that I went too far, that I should have just let it go, I hope whoever hears that story asks one question: what did you think would happen when she finally stopped pretending? Because that moment when they realized I wasn't coming back to play my part in their little performance was the moment they finally understood I wasn't just done with them. I had one. On my terms. Without ever having to become like them.